Good morning to all of you. Welcome to the Faculty of Law of Hong Kong U and to this seminar organized by the Philip K. Wong Center for Chinese Law. This seminar today is on dual mode, so I also welcome those of you who are attending via Zoom. And I think there are more people on Zoom than people in this room. But those in this room will be given priority in asking questions and giving comments. But those on Zoom are also welcome to ask questions. And we have got we'll be able to see your written questions here. So I'm very honored to introduce to you the speaker today, Ms. Amelia Low, who is actually a graduate and alumni of the Faculty of Law. She is a practicing solicitor in Hong Kong, and she's also qualified to practice in New York State, Washington, D.C., England, and the Greater Bay Area. Amelia is also widely read, widely studied in other fields. She got a Master of Business Administration at Chinese U of Hong Kong and also a Master of Public Health at Harvard University. And she also very varied rich practicing experience. She has practiced in Hong Kong as well as Beijing, Shanghai, Dalian, and Washington, D.C., and Dubai, as well as Rome. And her clients included Fortune 100 companies and international organizations. So I just mentioned that Amelia has practiced in Dubai, so her talk today is not about Dubai, but about Indonesia, but she has agreed to give another talk on Dubai in the same series, Belt and Road Law Seminar series. So this is the first seminar in this Law and Belt Law Seminar series. And the topic will be legal and regulatory landscape for businesses in Indonesia. So you will talk for about 40 minutes? How many
sure, approximately that.
Yeah, so we'll then leave about 20 minutes for discussion. So may I now hand over to Amelia.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. So a very great honor to be back at my alma mater. And today the series is an important series for the Belt and Road series, in which we talk more about how the Belt and Road applies in practice with the law and business. So a little bit of introduction first about the Belt and Road. It's a great initiative by President Xi in order to have different countries work together in infrastructure, in economics, business, and law, including arbitration, mediation. And so there can be lots of collaboration and opportunities for the future. It's something that we can be very excited about once we learn about the different country and legal systems. It is also an important principle of legal, namely comity, to respect and learn from different countries all over the world and to work together with mutual respect. So a little bit about Indonesia. First of all, about the Belt and Road Initiative, it is global trade. And there are lots of policy and guidelines, which are important for different regions. So a little interactive part would be anyone here who is a law student. Could you please raise your hand? Thank you for being here. So it is interesting to legal students because, as you know, the world is becoming more and more globalized and there are lots of collaboration opportunities. And therefore, sometimes it's important to learn about different parts of the law and both common law, which is practiced in Hong Kong. You can learn also about civil law in civil law countries. And there may be slight differences, which we may have to be aware of. Therefore, we talk with our counterparts or friends from different countries we can show them the adequate respect and knowledge of their different places, which will be impressive and also a good foundation for future collaboration and learning opportunities. So Indonesia, there is lots of interest nowadays, and it's actually a little bit about why I'm talking about Indonesia and why I am suitable to talk about this. In fact, a little bit about this book was released this year by me and my team members. And this book was years of research, talking with different people from Indonesia, ranging from the government, the parliament, some trade associations, academic bodies, professional organizations, lawyers, accountants, and also during the course of the research for the book, me and my team went to Indonesia a few times, quite extended time, had in-depth research and interviews with the government, the ambassadors, Indonesian Chinese ambassadors, for instance, and also different businesses as well, both small and large businesses. And there was also a conference which we organized, and there were lots of businesses from China, small, medium, some even very large ones, who were interested to invest or work with or already have worked with Indonesia. And all these materials, interviews, talks, research, books they recommended, people they recommended, it's a time to thank them. And for this, we have all these research, which is not just legal, but also business, and also about a comprehensive approach in which we learned from and was able to write a more comprehensive review, which extends not only law, but also business and also customary everyday life. And of course, because of the years of time we spent to write the book, it is not able to talk about everything all at once. So I'm going to highlight the most important points, and if anybody is interested, we're happy to talk about them further and to talk about the in-depth projects that they did, because there are so many things inside, so many knowledge, and so many people we want to thank and acknowledge at the same time. Of course, to thank University of Hong Kong Professor Chen for this great opportunity to share with you all. So again, being a lawyer, the usual disclaimer is for informational purposes and academic purposes only, not legal advice. So looking at the strategic context, indeed, Indonesia is famous for being a maritime hub. It's also one of the largest countries in Asia other than China, and there's a growing young population with a large number of people under the age of 30. And therefore, its GDP growth is projected at 5% in 2024, according to the Asian Development Bank. There's indeed sustained growth, and it has a great potential to be a key player in the Belt and Road Initiative. So the international law and the trade system is important because it has lots of resources. In mining, for instance, which I think lots of people know about, timber and all that, and also the economy with the maritime hub and its strategic location as well in Asia, which is quite near to Singapore and other countries. And there's also projects which have regional governance framework. So there are lots of projects which in Indonesia can spread over the different parts of Asia. And there's also like investment opportunities. But previously, it was only focused mainly on the investments with the neighboring countries, for example, Singapore, Thailand, for instance, and Australia as well. But now its importance has grown as people are more aligned with its resources and the strategic way that it wants to move its country. So this is celebrated by the change of presidency, in which a new government, which actually attended the meetings held by the local banks, which had the old president and the new president. And we also studied the ambitions and the strategic direction of the country, in which they have hoped for more international collaboration, particularly with China in the Belt and Road context. And there could be more projects and interactions between the two countries on this. So a little bit more about the Belt and Road, about the connectivity. So connectivity is very important, and there's important, a key term is sustainability, because to collaborate together, and to work well together, everything has to be sustainable. So there should be a win-win component in which everybody, in the end, economically, socially, culturally, will gain together. And therefore, there are sometimes for the Belt and Road Initiative, some kinds of MOUs in which different companies want, or even different trade bodies, associations want to collaborate with each other, and they to show their intent and goodwill, they have an MOU, and which will be later followed by binding contracts to celebrate and cement the relationship. So sometimes there will be soft laws and treaties to mention about their collaborations. But sometimes there's also the need for regional dispute centers, and Hong Kong is going to be an international arbitration center, which is great. So Hong Kong IAC has an important role to play. There's also funding projects which are required by Chinese banks because a lot of these infrastructure projects would require a huge amount of capital. And therefore, to make sure that the project is sustainable, not just 5 years, right, but 10 years and more, for instance, there will be adequate funding by these Chinese banks. And nowadays, with ESG more important, there will be more ESG, environmental, social responsibilities, in which the projects, because in the development, sometimes if you use mining, for instance, certain pollution materials may result, and therefore how to make sure the project is compliant with the global standards of ESG, at the same time is economically viable. Because often when you do these kinds of projects, when you do the economic part, then sometimes you would have to do something on the environmental part. Therefore, it's a very extended project in which sometimes experts are called in to look into the ESG components so that not only the economic component is sustainable, but the environmental damage is minimized. And the compliance costs increase sometimes because of that. And therefore, there's a great balance between the two, which has to be maintained. Also in contracts, there are different laws included. So conflict of law principles sometimes apply in international law. And therefore, for risk management purposes, there is sometimes a need to look into the different laws and the studies and see, in case of a conflict, which law is a governing law which is to be applied. So for the strategic role of Indonesia, there's indeed key projects like the Jakarta-Bandung Railway. So how many of you have been to Indonesia? Can you please raise your hands? Thank you. So you may have heard of this railway, and also the fact that the capital is being moved to another place, which would take a couple of years, according to my friends. So it's a time in which Indonesia is a time trying to make up and increase its strategic projects, which would help to develop and revamp the country into a stronger country with more infrastructure and more convenient. So railway is a way to do that. Industrial park as well is a way to do that. And you want to increase the accessibility, transportability, so that people can easily access from all over the world the different kinds of projects. Which I'm going to Indonesia, I'm not sure if you've been to the industrial parks. So there are different industrial parks for different themes and different projects. And certain kinds of projects are promoted by the government in certain parts. And sometimes industrial parks, they have like the science park in Hong Kong, for instance, there are different kinds of projects, like biotech, for instance, in Hong Kong. And Indonesia has also different themes as well, in which they want to promote. And sometimes all these members in the ecosystem, they can collaborate with each other. So they're like strategic partners in which they want ecosystem or ecosystem park to have legal consultancy to support the companies, and also to have the infrastructure like timber, for instance, timber resources plants, those that can transport the timber, for instance, and then some of them would be the electricity producing companies as well. So there's a cluster of these kinds of companies which they can all collaborate with each other and interact. And therefore the policy has to align with the strategy and of the different parts of the municipal governments. And therefore, when companies want to go to Indonesia, the first thing is where to go. There are so many parts, right? Some people want to be near the Jakarta, near the capital, like the current capital, to be close to the government if there's government-related work or trade-related work. Some of them would want a more sparse population place with less people. Therefore, they can have like better fresh air and more natural resources. And some of them prefer densely populated areas, like fintech, for instance. And some of them are elderly care, for instance. They want a place which is more relaxing for the people to relax. And for example, Bali as well. There's like medical tourism, for instance. So the hospital clusters and then the elderly home clusters as well. So it all depends on what type of infrastructure and project the person would want to do. So looking at the economic and investment landscape, indeed, there are lots of things that can be discovered. And how much is the population actually? It is expected to reach approximately 300 million by 2030, according to United Nations. So indeed, the GDP growth has remained resilient. And there's also in Indonesia, a known as law on job creation. So they want to have more new capital projects and have more jobs to help, especially the young population who just graduated from university. And why is the population structure that important? Indeed, the population growth shapes the consumption markets. Because we're looking at Indonesia, there are lots of people, young people in particular, and we discover that they actually do have a high consumption power. So a lot of them do like their mobile phones, as I think many of you and I do as well. So with the mobile phones, they can access a lot of fintech projects or games in particular, or even e-banking, for instance. And all this can support the growth of this kind of mobile phone related or e-commerce related companies. For example, one of my alumni before, instead of working in the government, is now working for a fintech company because he thinks there's great potential in the area, especially with the young population and the increasing use of mobile phones. Another place which I think with the younger population, there's also the market for snacks, for instance. The Indo noodles are very popular, for instance. I'm not sure, have you tried of the Indo noodles? Yes, Indomie, yes. So those kinds are quite famous. And actually, I stayed in a hotel in the same building as the Indomie noodles. So every day, every morning, I smell the Indo noodles. And that's also something quite popular with the young people because young people, they like to sleep late and they like to have fast food when they're stressed and when they're busy at work. And so those kind of like food, instance, and snacks as well, is also kind of shaped by the population structure and the population demand. So investment climate wise, so is uneven across the different regions. So some places are more densely populated than others. The traffic is quite famous, for instance, for those who've been there. And therefore, there's a highly concentrated population in the center. However, if you've been to the other less densely populated areas in Bali, for instance, or even some like less known places in some of the islands, and those islands are not reachable by local planes. You have to wait until they have some kind of chartered planes, maybe only once a week, if there's a great sufficient demand by the local people, or they use trains to get there. So no direct transport, no population density, and those places would have less investment climate. But again, a lot is changing because with the initiatives of the government and the increasing initiatives of Belt and Road, lots and lots more of Chinese companies are going there, and therefore more and more places are now being more developed, and the transport is likely, hopefully, will improve. So looking at the legal and regulatory architecture, indeed, there's a civil law foundation, and that's very important to note because of the civil law foundation, which is quite different from common law, and I'll not elaborate on this because it's a long story on how civil law and common law differentiates. But the civil law focus, and therefore there are lots of approvals required for the projects. And the approval, sometimes you look at the law, but sometimes you also look in practice as well, with the government practice and the also the latest political situation in which some projects are being promoted. And therefore, for investment-wise, the BKPM is one of the key authorities for that. So sometimes customary law is there, and therefore one has to look at the history and culture of the place, of the particular province, for instance, and also the government and the parliament as well, to see how and why certain areas of land are more developed than others, and why certain areas of land are more promoted than others, and the location of the industrial parks, for instance, in which one chooses. So some companies I know they want to build a whole new industrial park all by themselves and equip it with everything. While some companies they want to have some industrial park space and also some commercial area space outside the residential park. So they have a linkage between the two. And when going to this, I'll talk a little bit about how usually companies invest in Indonesia. So some people, when they invest in Indonesia, they would like to open a new company, for instance, all brand new. And the second way is some people want to have joint ventures with the local, international, or Indonesian counterpart in order to have the alliances, in order to have a better local insights into the place. And most importantly, you need to know that there are important agreements for joint ventures, and some of the agreements, including the equivalent of a memorandum and article of association that we have in Hong Kong, equivalent of that. But it also has to be in Indonesian language as well. So you can see that certain parts, there are still some local elements. So joint ventures is one, and then opening a new company is another. And some people would like to just import their goods to Indonesia, and they have to go through customs, of course, and therefore they have to explore whether the goods are the goods that customs would allow and whether they need to apply for any licenses. And some of the people, they are interested in Indonesia, but still understanding the landscape and looking into the opportunities and also thinking about how best they can collaborate. So there can be other ways as well, like M&A, for instance, and other like company collaborations, more formal collaborations, marked by a joint venture or some looser collaborations as well by MOUs and other contracts. And therefore, with these kinds, you can know that there is a great deal of demand for Indonesia because when writing this book, I actually researched into the locations in which Chinese companies would most like to invest, and Indonesia is one of the top, especially for Asia. So Dubai, in the latest lecture, that would also be another top area as well. And for Indonesia in particular, it's closer to China, so the proximity. There's also quite a large Chinese population as well. And so there are lots of people who can speak Chinese, which is good as well when people explore the place they would like to collaborate. They would also want to have people that can speak the same language as well. And lots of people speak English as well. And so it's quite common for some people, sometimes they do not even speak the English language. They can still survive in Indonesia if they can speak good Chinese. So looking at the foreign investment framework, so what sectors are most attractive for foreign direct investment? It's something question which many would ask. So when you want to go there, so there's so many opportunities possible. Which one would you concentrate on? And therefore, it's important to look at the investment law number 25207. There's indeed a positive investment list which regulates sectors, and that one promotes and talks about the sectors which the government would like to promote. And of course, it may change based on the different kinds of structures or the government policies. In fact, according to statistics, only 36% of foreign investors feel adequately informed about regulatory changes. And therefore, it's very important to have sufficient information. So for people who want to invest in Indonesia, usually the first thing we recommend to them is to go and visit Indonesia themselves. This is one way to look here about it, is another way to visit it and really engage with the culture, engage with the people who are quite friendly, and learn about the different ways, the cultures, the people, investment culture, trade and customs. For instance, people know that Indonesians, some of them, like in Dubai, some of them do have to pray like 5 times a day. And therefore, if you have meetings with them, sometimes they may suddenly disappear. But of course, not everybody has to pray 5 times a day. So therefore, sometimes you have to be aware of this as well. Also looking at the investment framework, there's a licensing process by the OSS, and there are different strategic sectors. However, for the FDI, sometimes there is some kind of structuring required when you invest in it, and you have to make sure the entity you invest or the way that you invest is one that is most compliant with the local laws at the time. Indeed, the FDI grew by 11% in 2022, so there's indeed investor confidence, and it shows that what the government has done to reform and to make it stronger and more attractive to foreigners is working. And indeed, it's a good thing when you want to invest in it to look for your own interest, perhaps the sectors that people are currently working with at the moment, and also the sectors at the time of investment in Indonesia that people would like to welcome in. And there are some priority projects which may have incentives. So looking into the entry structure, indeed, usually people use a foreign investment limited company. And for sensitive areas, which we talked about earlier, there's some joint ventures, so some local components sometimes is encouraged, and licensing is required, and some licensing process is longer than others. And sometimes when looking at businesses, investment, instead of just looking at legal, sometimes we look at the commercial risks as well. So economic risks, looking at the currency, looking at the political risks, whether they welcome investments in that particular sector. Also look at the legal risk, of course, mediation, arbitration, and litigation in the local courts. And we don't want the local courts, you would have to remove that provision and opt for arbitration mediation in the contract before you deal with it. And also other kinds of risks as well, like intellectual property rights. Is it adequately protected? The tax system and those kinds of things. So many of them are covered in the book. So as a brief overview, you need to know that the legal personality is important for contractual rights, and also the difference in compliance. So some people have different levels of compliance required for different sectors. So the ones encouraged usually is more loose, but of course, we have to look very carefully into the time you're investing and the bodies that you're working with, and also the sectors and areas as well, and the structure is also very important. So looking at the sectors that they encourage, a guideline, a starting point, would be the restricted or prohibited sectors. So for instance, defense and national security is restricted. There's limited in the forestry and natural resources. Now that is important because a lot of people think of Indonesia, they think about the beautiful scenery, abundance of natural resources, timber, wood, and forestry. And it's great for building furniture, for instance. But you should know that it is limited as a sector. It means that you can invest in that, but there are some restrictions. So that is something to note. And of course, telecommunications. And then there's education and media, which is partially restricted. And there's also sometimes there's some exceptions. Again, studying law, you know that sometimes there are good rules and sometimes exceptions as well. And therefore, we have to look carefully into what is allowed and what is accepted. As well as looking at the taxation, for instance. The taxation structure is not too complicated. So corporate tax, 22%. There's income tax as well, VAT as well, and some kinds of incentives as well. But it's generally OECD aligned, and therefore there's more transparency. So sometimes taxation also an area which people would consider. For example, if you compare it with UAE, place we talk about next time, there's less tax there, for instance. So corporate is like 9%, and then the individuals, there is still no income tax. And sometimes people, when they look at this, they don't just look at one country, right? But they look at a Belt and Road country, they compare different countries and see which country is best in terms of the strategic alignments, incentives, positive list or restricted list, and also the taxation and framework, and also how complex is it in terms of regulatory standards, and how much the natural resources in there are comparable in relative to the industry that you're trying to enter, or the current synergies that you already have, and also whether people already have people that they know from the particular country, and that is something that people also consider as well. So it's just hard to just look at one area and say, the tax is higher than the other, and to make a decision just based on one factor. So a multi-pronged approach is something very important. because usually when people try to 找出去 in the 国词 in that particular aspect, they would look at different regions and countries. They want to export the goods or import the goods. They would not just look at one. They would look at a couple, and which one to choose first and which one to do second and third, for instance, would also depend a lot on the budget of the country, the company, and also how welcoming they perceive and how the regulatory hurdles they consider to be important. So a holistic approach is what we recommend, to look both at legal, business, economics, and also to keep in mind with the changing considerations. So tax, again, there are sometimes transfer pricing rules, but those are enforced strictly. Sometimes there's some double trade agreements, so it would help investment, and one would have to check comprehensively whether there is such an agreement in place, and whether one's project is a green project. Again, have to look at the definition of what is a green project, and therefore, when looking at the business sector as well, one has to look carefully. The legal structure was very important, and what is written, and also what is practiced in custom as well. So we would recommend early due diligence as well for compliance issues. And sometimes there's also corporate governance issues. So again, long-term planning with accountants as well to reduce the audit risk, because there are different kinds of taxation standards, accounting standards, legal standards, and even sometimes different languages applied as well. And even the same word, which sounds the same, can mean different things across different jurisdictions. So it is something to be very important to pay attention to. So looking at compliance and risk, for instance, there can be a multitude of things. So anti-corruption law is very important, and that applies to different countries as well. Different countries have the different anti-corruption laws. And some projects, they have an important mandated ESG reporting component, which is very important. And it signifies the commitment of the government who wants the companies to invest in them to help with the environment and social governance and help to improve the living standard of the people. I went to a class called Purpose and Profit in my studies, and that class teaches about the importance not just looking at profits, but also having a sense of purpose, in which some kinds of projects, like ESG projects in this case, help to improve the overall livelihood of the people around, giving jobs to the teenagers or the young population, helping the local, like provincial villages who are impoverished, help them develop and make them able to generate wealth in the decades to come. So there's a saying where I give a person to fish, or is it better to give a person a fish or to teach him how to fish? In which these ESG projects are trying to teach the local people the skills and some kinds of talent transfer. For instance, for Chinese companies, they teach them how to do mining, for instance, sustainably, and therefore in the future there can be sustainable mining, and therefore the natural resources can be used at the rate which is sustainable. And also these kind of young people who did not learn a trade or craft, or may not have studied a lot in university, can still have a trade and craft which they can teach in the future generations. And that's why certain aspects are promoted by the government, like the technological aspects, for instance. So it's important for the corporations not just to comply because of the law, but we also encourage corporate social responsibility for the corporate reputation, because it is a good thing and a great thing to spread it to different parts of the world, that projects, instead of just earning money, can also be sustainable and also help the ESG. And also they are compliant with the ESG requirements of the local country. Indeed, it's very important for the companies to have stakeholder engagement. And again, contracts would also measure via single, or not a single indicator, one of the indicators that will talk about what you need to pay attention to. And sometimes some contracts can designate that if, for example, the pollution amount is reduced, then what kind of incentives contract-wise. So contract can be used, for instance, to help to encourage certain kind of behaviors, which would help economic growth and environmental growth at the same time. And for instance, there can also be a deterrent principle as well in the contract in which there's, for example, too much pollution done by certain kinds of companies. There can also be some kind of punitive clauses in the contract as well. So it helps to align compliance with risk management and also with ESG in order that when you invest in a country, in the Belt and Road, not only are you bringing in the technology transfer, and also there could be relationships among the different cultures, long-term relationships of growth, and they can also be win-win in which the environment of both places are improved with the newer technological transfer. And then this can have long-term implications for long-term friendship and collaboration between the two countries, with a greater improvement, not only in economic-wise, but also in the social, in the growth, the environment of the place, which is something to be considered as well. In terms of the labor law, which is also one of the parts that have to be looked at, so there's a standard work week of 40 hours, and of course there's some protection for employees, so there's some overtime as well. And there's a distinguish between fixed term and permanent contracts, which are quite different, and also some kinds of social insurance contributions, which makes sure that the rights of the employees are adequately protected. And the rights include the health and pension. So you can see that the local government are trying to protect the local people as well, which is a quite important thing. So some people might ask, what are the challenges of ensuring compliance with labor law regulations in Indonesia? Indeed, sometimes there are some terms or contracts or in practice which only one who is involved may know, for instance, overtime. So it's paid according to law, but how do you enforce it? And what happens if the person, for the employees, you're willing to pay them, but even if you pay them, they refuse to work. So these kinds of things may happen. And how to deal with it according to the local law at the time. So there is also some practical implications. And sometimes when you're working like overnight in the weekends, and it's something that you want to know, you have a quick answer to something, but sometimes you may realize that if you do not think about this issue in advance and research the relevant laws and procedures, then if you don't have a policy in place, then the supervisors, because we find that a lot of the companies, the supervisors may be Chinese supervisors, but sometimes during like Chinese New Year, for instance, the Chinese supervisors may have gone home for their Chinese New Year holiday, and therefore the people left behind are the Indonesians, for instance. Then would the Indonesians know what to do if some of the Indonesian employees refuse to work overtime? So what would they do about it? Therefore, it's very important to anticipate possible considerations or scenarios that may occur and have a comprehensive guidebook, for instance, or guidance for these like newly established Chinese companies in Indonesia, for instance, to know what to do should something like that arise in advance. And so certain things are legal and also about regulatory as well, not just like outside compliance, but also internal compliance in one's own company as well. And therefore, comprehensive strategy both externally in order to comply with the law and internally to ensure that you meet your compliance in day-to-day management in special circumstances or unexpected circumstances is also very important. So about contract law and liability, again, quite legalese involved. And there's breach of contracts and remedies is governed by the civil code. So there's sometimes actual loss and expected losses. And therefore one has to be aware of how expected losses are calculated, because the expectations and the reliance principles may not be the same as the ones in the legal principles doctrine that you are used to. Because some compensation covers direct and consequential damages as well, so consequential. So what types of loss are not too remote? I still remember studying principles of negligence and what is too remote and all that. But does the same common law principles and case law apply to Indonesia? So that is something food for thought. And if not, what do you do? And what is the standard? And how do you find out the actual standard? And does the actual standard change over time? That is something that one has to examine as well. And there's also a duty to mitigate loss required, and also force majeure and penalty clauses. So when you just hear of these names, it may seem to be common law terms, which may actually have different meanings. So that is important to be aware as well. So in terms of intellectual property, there is of course, very important need to safeguard innovation and therefore to have these IP rights. And there's also protection to patents, trademarks, and copyright. And therefore, it's important to have local legal representation right at the start in order to reduce the chance of infringement and protect trade secrets. So data privacy and consumer protection, very important principle. The updates in the law, in the constitutional law, they talk about personal data protection. And that means that is an increasingly safeguard principle that's important, especially for like fintech or technology companies, in which cross-border data transfer requires consent, so data stored locally, and then digital compliance as well. And also there's penalties for breaches. And that is a welcome step in which it means that the government is trying to encourage more people to have brands, international brands in Indonesia, because the consumer protection and the IP is a cornerstone of innovation. And in terms of dispute resolution enforcement, there's arbitration preferred over court litigation, and there are different legal standards that can be used and different arbitral bodies can be used. Also, New York Convention rights can also be there. But sometimes courts retain the final discretion. And in terms of the culture, which we'll talk about later, is a mediation. It's good about the culture because the culture, with a lot of people believing in the consensus culture in which they want to resolve conflicts peacefully, mediation would be a good way for them and for foreign practices as well, because mediation can be binding, confidential, and for litigation there's more uncertainty, disputes can play out for years, and sometimes local courts is not very sure because of the translation and those kinds of local courts. It's hard to predict what they're going to do, and therefore with mediation arbitration there can be more legal certainty and in certain cases even confidentiality. Because businesses, right, especially new businesses that have entered the country for the first time would not want to be sued. And that's not good publicity for the company. So in terms of culture, so there's lots and lots of culture actually, a quite diverse culture landscape, and there are lots of languages spoken in Indonesia. These are the basic languages. Therefore, there's a multicultural benefit in which different cultures can live together harmoniously. But sometimes for negotiations, there's also a hierarchical structure. So it's very important for them to perceive the person to enter the negotiation to be the person of equal caliber, for instance. Even in meetings, for instance, sometimes if the minister is there, then they would expect us to send somebody of equal caliber to a minister. If the vice minister, then a vice minister equivalent person. So the CEO of a company, you would expect the CEO of another company to be there. If the person is a manager, they would expect a manager to be there. So it's some kind of hierarchical. And it shows respect, and also therefore, in advance of negotiation meetings or meetings, even planning and preliminary sessions, they would require this rule. So it's not written in black and white, but they would expect it. So when the person gives you a name card introduced as a title, they would expect a similar person on the same team. And therefore, preparation before meetings in order to show respect is very important. Also, there's a local culture, which people have to show deference to their culture and respect in order to show that one is willing to collaborate with them for the long term. And indeed, there have been incidents in the past in which sometimes due to translation matters, some kind of misunderstandings have occurred. And when you easily explain and realize what is a translation error, then some misunderstandings can be resolved adequately and quickly. But sometimes because of the language barrier, some people may not realize there is certain kinds of misunderstandings by certain kinds of terms. And therefore, it is very important to know and show respect at the first glance, because if there is no respect, it is very hard to reach a deal or even collaborate. And therefore, it's very important to know about the culture and show adequate deference to the culture. with cultural intelligence as a strategic asset. So there have been numerous case studies, not talking about them in the long term. The book has more case studies as well. But basically, case studies are important in order to learn from the good case studies about why certain companies have successfully navigated the different kinds of challenges, and also in some companies which were sued by the courts. It's very important to know and learn from the mistakes in order to prevent it from happening again in the future. And therefore, it's good to study different case studies for good case studies and also some negative case studies as well. In terms of the strategic compliance access is a corporate capital, which is a kind of human capital, and also for corporate capital is a strategic way forward in which companies and human, they both move into a new place and learn how to use the resources most effectively. It also improves the competitiveness of the person and also of the company. And also ethical behavior, importantly, brings trust. And there's also importance why legal literacy is so important, because with legal literacy, you can ensure sustainability. Because when you comply with the rules and you show people that you comply with the rules, that you're serious about doing business and you really care about the culture, you respect them, you respect the laws and regulations, and without the legal risks, one is able to have a company survive there and personally survive there as well for the long term. And therefore, when companies want to go to Indonesia, one of the first questions is, how long are you there in? Are you there for the short term, meaning you want to reap the profits quickly, or you're there for the long term? If you're there for the long term, very important to learn about the legal rules and regulations, and also to make sure that there is regulatory alignment. So, in conclusion, there is a theoretical reflection. Laws helps economic development, and therefore these regulatory transplants help local law. And these kinds of legal norms may change over time, but we can have contract as a governance tool. Indeed, for legal models, there are different kinds of ones. And indeed, according to McKinsey, 023, there's 80% of businesses which cite legal knowledge as critical for long-term sustainability. Therefore, having long-term legal sustainability is crucial. And that's thank you to all of you here today, which makes sure that the legal systems and long-term legal literacy is promoted. And therefore, Indonesia is a critical Belt and Road partner, and compliance is strategic advantage. And that's all I would like to say today. So thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Chen.
Okay, thank you, Amelia, for giving us a very interesting and informative talk covering very wide range of matters relevant to business investment in Indonesia. Actually, I know that you didn't have time to talk about the case studies. Maybe you can spend two or 3 minutes to introduce to us what case studies have you got?
Sure. So one of them is Cali's special vehicles, is translated name. So they entered the market during economic slowdown. And so it's a challenging time to be there. And the main question when looking at these case studies I would pose to you is, what lessons have you learned from these companies' approach to navigating local markets? What lessons that can be drawn? So personally, you can draw to your, and also as a professionally for your company as well. Because there's lots of resilience and personal determination, and also collaboration and conflict resolution skills, personally, that one can learn. And also some legal skills, business navigating, negotiation skills involved as well for the business involved. For them, they had the joint venture, which helped them in the start to have local legitimacy. Because when you enter into a new location, often people ask, like, who are you and why are you here? And why do you think you are able to enter into my country and develop, for example, cars, for instance? And have you worked here before? And how do I know that your car is better than my country's car? And why should you use your car instead of a local company's car? We ask you these questions. And therefore, this company is very strategic in which it has a joint venture. And therefore, it already, in the beginning, builds up local legitimacy. And with these local partners' help, they already have certification, customs, and licensing sorted out for them, which helped in the process. Because these kinds of issues, sometimes it may seem peripheral at first glance, but if you look carefully and if they're not adhered to, may cause litigations or government regulations or investigations in the future. And it also had a Belt and Road platform, so it enabled co-development with different kinds of companies as well. And therefore, with these strategic compliance, there was a success. So this is a short story. And then for Xintang Tanfu bicycles, so this is bicycle and e-bicycle production. And its good thing is that it had localized assembly for the demand. So the demand was Indonesian driven. So they did research and they calculated how much demand will be required, which means that they do not produce more than necessary. And if you produce more than necessary, you know, right, the price would go down because there's too much storage and warehouse storage, and you have to get rid of the storage. And sometimes if there are natural disasters and you produce too much stuff, right, some of the goods may be damaged as well. And therefore, they're very strategic in which they have localized assembly and they calculated the demand very well. And they were able to achieve the export contracts. And they also had a joint venture, like the first case. And the supply chain was very well integrated under the Belt and Road Initiative. And they also had compliance, legal compliance particularly, which ensured the regulatory approvals were taken. And that is very important to show that in their success, they have followed the laws, and they've also found, business-wise, a strategic partner to help them navigate the chances. Because sometimes in business, as in personal life, there's like SWOT analysis where it's right. Look at the strengths, weakness, opportunities, threats, and what kinds of things would be better outsourced to the local company, what better sources to do them themselves, what do their competitors are interested in, and what do they need help with. So that's why they were able to be very successful in these two cases. And of course, there are many cases and also some negative cases in which some companies were sued. And lots of the reasons were because they did not pay attention to the regulatory approvals. Some companies just rush in, right? They see the possibility of advancement and possibility of earning money, and then you just rush in, right? And usually you say when you rush in, usually sometimes certain things may happen. So litigation-wise and business-wise, which may not be very favorable in the long run. And therefore, a cool collected approach with sufficient legal support and local partnership is very important, is what we can learn from these two cases. Thank you, Professor Chen.
Okay, thank you. I think these case studies are very useful, particularly for us to understand the practicalities of investing in Indonesia. So maybe I'll invite the audience to ask questions, if any, or to give comments.
So I understand that the BRI is trying to reshape law, but this isn't the first move, especially in, say, arbitration. I know the Asia Pacific Economic Council, APEC, has similar movements. They're stuck here with like ADR providers, ultimate dispute resolution, various SMEs that APEC has put together. And I'm just kind of curious, how does the BRI actually influence law and regulation on the ground? Because the ADB suggests that most ASEAN countries have a rather chaotic mess of regulation. This is more, there is official state support given by, say, the Chinese government in helping companies navigating local regulations? Or is this actually being passed, administrative orders are being passed by the legislature or agencies in Indonesia? Or is it just like sort of like the U.S. Commercial Service or various export assistance groups that help with foreign investment by their own country?
Would you like to answer first or to collect more questions?
Yeah, we can collect all the questions.
Okay, we'll collect more questions and comments. Anyone else? There's also some questions online, but we'll invite the people here to questions first. Yes.
Thank you, Amelia. I understand that the bank financing is a very important part of the role initiative. So, what are the bank's expectations for the bank role initiative, particularly in issue?
Okay. Maybe I'll take one question online. The question refers to the political scientist John Mishima commenting that security trumps economics. Security trumps economics. So with respect to the digital Silk Road, may I know how law can navigate geopolitical concerns on FDI screening or investment contracts involving the use of cross-border data or the data storage and investments on data economy. So I suppose the question is mainly about geopolitical aspects of FDI screening and also cross-border data, particularly contracts involving use of cross-border data. There's also a reference to data storage and investment on data economy, which I'm not, I don't fully understand anyway. So that is the one question online. Yes. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is the repatriation of capital. Say I put in a certain amount of money, and then when I bring it back to China, for example, so is there any control or restriction on that? My second question is, can foreigners be director of the company, like and shareholders of the company, or have it to be another sort of company?
Thank you. So maybe we collect one final question. Well, there are two. So the two of you.
Of course, one of the most eye-catching projects of the BRI is about the highway. Sorry, the train between Bandung and Jakarta. So we'd like to elaborate a bit more about the latest development and how it can be resolved, because it seems to be it turned out to be very good. And also in view of its implication to many other similar projects in the ASEAN countries like Laos, Vietnam, and also Malaysia.
Okay, thank you. So maybe last question.
How do you describe the effectiveness or efficiency of the Indonesian court when trying to solve the dispute through the court system in Indonesia?
Okay, so thank you very much for all the questions. So maybe we will invite Amelia to just to respond as far as you think it is appropriate to respond.
Thank you very much for all the insightful questions and thought-provoking questions. So a very long list, right? Almost, I think, 10 questions because of the time limitation. So I think I will try to address as much as possible, and more questions can be read from the book as well. And I can also give you my WeChat, which is called Opera Singing, so OPERASINGING. If you want to have further questions, because of the limitations of time. And briefly, because there's so many questions, so there's Belt and Road Initiative. So it's a very important initiative. It's different from others because it has the great support of the government and also of different organizations, both the public sector, the private sector, all support these initiatives, which is very important. And it's not just the Belt and Road Initiative, not just business, there's also legal, there's also policy, which is a very comprehensive initiative, which encompasses different sectors and also with different like arbitrations. There's also things for like African countries, Middle Eastern countries, like South American countries, for instance. And these kinds of infrastructure projects with the Asian Development Bank, for instance, they can all work together to have a comprehensive dispute resolution mechanism. Also, there's research, lots of research done by different scholars all around the world to collaborate and also to implement these kinds of strategies. For the banks, so there are different banks involved. So there are like local banks, international banks, and different banks have different expectations. And we attended some of the events from the largest bank of Indonesia and also one of the smallest banks in Indonesia. So we can find that some of the activities by the different banks are quite similar or they're quite different. And sometimes some of the smaller banks, there are some larger than you expect activities, because all of these banks, I think they share a similar goal in which they want there to be more collaboration between the two places. Because why? Collaboration is important and good for business. If people have collaborations, the banks do make money, right? And they also help to facilitate and also help to support the investments. And therefore, I think for different banks, so of course, different banks have different characteristics and different nuances and expectations. We look deeply. But all of them want there to be more collaboration, more business, and more development in the long run, which will be good to both countries and also to the banks and the people as well. For the digital Silk Road, there is indeed different countries involved, and this is also a very important collaborative initiative, and also the Maritime Silk Road as well, and Indonesia being a strategic location in Asia and the world as well. So there can be more and more cross-border aspects and collaboration of these different projects. As for the political aspects and how law can navigate it, well, first law, you would look at the more neutral part, right? So when you look at the law, of course, you look at the neutral part in which you look what is actually described in the different laws of the different countries, and with relation with the latest developments in law and the different developments as well. So all that is being studied by lawyers, looking not just at law, but at the legal side and the business side, and of course the policy side. And therefore, law in that aspect will try to balance the different needs and different competing priorities of the client to find out the best way, which is the best way at the time, right? And for a particular company. And what fits for one country may not fit for another. So what fits for one company may not fit for another. And therefore, instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, you have a comprehensive, holistic approach based on the current needs, the most pressing needs and priorities of the companies at the time, in order to help to try best to navigate. And of course, when certain political environment changes, certain policy changes, and certain economic conditions changes as well, the approach may be different. And therefore, that's important. That's why to have a vigilant professional team to help you monitor legal and accounting, to look at what is the latest changes and to respond accordingly. So upon the cross-border data, so a lot of the data principles would respect and organize the local storage of data aspect. And in terms of the different types of companies, they would have different regulations as well. So one would have to delve into the particular sector to see what is the cross-border data actually required for the level of data encryption and the level of data storage exactly required for that industry. As for the contractual use of the cross-border data, so there's also, of course, the contracts which the company has to sign. And also, when in the international world, there are lots of different kinds of businesses involved in the circular economy, and therefore you have to obey just not the cross-border data requirement of your own company, but that of your counterparts, right? Your partners, the competitors, and the industry standard as well at the prevailing time. So all of this has to be examined and explored in detail as well. And also, of course, of the company or the municipality as well. And of course, of the customers as well. So that is a very complicated area, right? Internet law, people are from all different parts of the world, competitors, colleagues, partners, different parts of the world, and therefore all these kinds of regulations. And sometimes people would adopt the strictest one, right, for safety and security. As for the capital and the reparation, that part would be an important thing and something worth further research as well. As for the train, I think there are people who have different views on the train. So sometimes you have to wonder, have you tried riding the train before? So maybe next time, right, we can all, like, for those interested, can all ride on the train. And if you, after riding the train, you have first-hand experience to talk about how you feel about the train. Because on a particular day, a rainy day, for instance, or a sunny day, people may have different, I don't know, feelings, right? And if you're happy on the day and you ride the train, you may feel happier, for instance, right? It's an emotion, psychological part. So certain times will be good to experience it together and experience it firsthand, for instance, before thinking about what is good for the long run. And sometimes it's good for particular types of people in a particular time, may not be good for everyone at all times. So therefore, it's important to try out and see whether you and or other people who are trying to go there, whether the country is good for you and matches your local temperament. Some people like hot climates, some people like cold climates, for instance. And therefore, there are different kinds of requirements, right? And sometimes you won't know until you experience it, right? As the Chinese saying goes, right? You have to, you have to experience it yourself, right? See whether it's good for you, right? And as for the legal nuances of the different systems and all that thing, I think is something to be covered in another topic. So thank you so much for your questions and happy to answer them afterwards, right? If anybody has other follow-ups. And thank you so much again. It's a first time. Thank you. Talk about alma mater. So honored and thank you so much, you all.
So thank you, Amelia, for responding as far as you can to the questions. And I think because we have already exceeded the time for this seminar, so we won't be able to go into further detail. But thank you to all of you for attending, including those who are online. And I hope we'll be able to meet you and also Ms. Low again. I think Ms. Low has already planned a second seminar on Dubai, so legal and regulatory landscape for business in Dubai. So if you're interested, you are most welcome to attend that seminar as well, which will be in a few weeks' time. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you in the future.